In the year 1620, a small wooden ship called the Mayflower set sail from England. On board were more than 100 men, women, and children, later known as the Pilgrims. Why did they leave their homeland? Because they wanted something precious: freedom to worship in their own way. England had strict religious rules, and the Pilgrims dreamed of a new life, far across the ocean. On September 6, 1620, the Mayflower left the port of Plymouth. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was long and dangerous. The ship was just 100 feet long, and more than 100 people were packed inside. For 66 days, they faced powerful storms. Huge waves crashed against the wooden vessel. The wind howled, the ship leaked, and passengers often slept in the dark, damp lower decks. Food and water grew scarce. Seasickness spread quickly, and many people suffered in misery. Imagine months at sea, with no land in sight. Finally, in November 1620, after more than 2 months, a shout came from the lookout. Land! But instead of Virginia, where they had planned to settle, the Pilgrims had been blown off course. They landed far to the north, in what is today Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Before stepping ashore, they created a historic agreement, the Mayflower Compact. It was a promise to work together, make fair laws, and govern themselves. This simple document became a foundation for democracy in America. When the Pilgrims finally touched land at Plymouth Rock, winter had already begun. It would be a season of hardship, hunger, and loss. But that first step onto the New World marked the beginning of something larger, the story of a new colony, and the birth of traditions that shaped the United States. The Mayflower's voyage was not just a journey across the ocean. It was a journey of faith, courage, and hope, a story still remembered more than 400 years later. Over 400 years ago, a small group of people in England began to dream of a different life. They were known as the Pilgrims. But who were they? The Pilgrims were ordinary men and women, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, fathers, and children. Yet they had one thing in common: they wanted religious freedom. In England during the early 1600s, the Church of England controlled how people worshipped. Anyone who disagreed with its rules faced heavy fines, imprisonment, or worse. The Pilgrims, also called separatists, believed they should be free to worship God in their own way, without fear. At first, they fled to Holland, hoping to live peacefully. But life there was hard. They struggled with poverty, their children grew up speaking Dutch, and they feared losing their English identity. So, they made a bold decision. They would leave Europe altogether and start a new life in the New World, America. It was not an easy choice. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean meant danger, hunger, storms, and the unknown. Many knew they might never return. Yet, the Pilgrims believed their sacrifice was worth it, for freedom, for faith, and for the future of their children. In 1620, they joined with other settlers and boarded a small ship called the Mayflower. Over 100 passengers crowded inside, carrying only what they could hold. To the Pilgrims, America was more than just land. It was hope. It was the promise of a new beginning. When they finally arrived and settled at Plymouth, their courage laid the foundation for something much larger, the spirit of freedom and self-determination that would shape the United States for centuries to come. The Pilgrims were not just travelers. They were believers, dreamers, and pioneers, men and women whose search for liberty changed the course of history. In the early 1600s, England was a land of rules, especially when it came to religion. The Church of England controlled how people prayed, what they believed, and even where they worshipped. But not everyone agreed. A small group of men and women wanted to worship God in their own way. They believed faith should be personal, not forced by kings or bishops. These people were called separatists, later known as the Pilgrims. For their beliefs, they paid a heavy price. If they refused to attend the king's church, they could be fined. If they spoke against it, they could be jailed. And if they continued, their very lives could be in danger. So, the Pilgrims searched for a place where they could live freely. First, they moved to Holland, a country known for tolerance. There, they found safety, but not comfort. Work was hard, pay was low, and life as foreigners was difficult. Their children grew up speaking Dutch, and many feared losing their English identity. Still, the Pilgrims never gave up their dream. They wanted a new beginning, somewhere they could live by their faith and build a future for their families. That dream pointed them across the ocean, to the New World. It was not an easy choice. America was far away, filled with unknown dangers, storms at sea, hunger, disease, and uncertainty. But to the Pilgrims, it was worth the risk. In 1620, they gathered their courage, left behind their homes, and boarded a small wooden ship called the Mayflower. For them, the journey was not just about land or riches. It was about something greater, freedom. The reasons they left England were simple, but powerful. To worship freely, to protect their families, and to build a new life where hope could grow stronger than fear. Their sacrifice gave birth to one of the most important chapters in American history, proof that the search for freedom can change the world. In September of 1620, more than 100 men, women, and children stepped onto a small wooden ship, the Mayflower. They were bound for the New World, but before they reached it, they had to endure 66 long days at sea. Life aboard the Mayflower was anything but easy. The ship was only about 100 feet long, barely the size of a modern basketball court. Over 100 people were crammed inside, with little room to move. Families slept in dark, damp spaces below deck, where the air was stale and foul. The voyage was rough. Storms tossed the ship violently. Huge waves crashed over the deck, and water leaked into the lower levels. Many passengers grew seasick, lying helpless in their bunks. Others tried to cook simple meals, but the food quickly spoiled. Drinking water turned stale, and clean conditions were impossible. Everyday life was a struggle. Children cried from hunger, mothers tried to comfort them, and men prayed for calm seas. The noise of creaking wood and pounding waves never stopped. At night, the darkness was overwhelming, broken only by lanterns that flickered in the wind. And yet, the Pilgrims endured. They sang hymns to keep their spirits alive. They shared what little they had. And they held on to their faith that beyond the horizon lay freedom and a new beginning. By October, fierce storms battered the Mayflower. At one point, the main beam cracked, and many feared the ship would sink. But with determination, the crew repaired it, and the journey continued. After more than 2 months at sea, hope finally returned. In November 1620, a lookout cried, "Land!" The long, miserable voyage was over. The Pilgrims had survived hunger, sickness, storms, and fear. Life aboard the Mayflower had tested them in every way, but their courage carried them through. For 66 days, that tiny ship was their entire world. And when they finally stepped onto the shores of the New World, they carried with them not just exhaustion, but the strength and faith that would build. In September of 1620, more than 100 men, women, and children stepped onto a small wooden ship, the Mayflower. They were bound for the New World, but before they reached it, they had to endure 66 long days at sea. Life aboard the Mayflower was anything but easy. The ship was only about 100 feet long, barely the size of a modern basketball court. Over 100 people were crammed inside, with little room to move. Families slept in dark, damp spaces below deck, where the air was stale and foul. The voyage was rough. Storms tossed the ship violently. Huge waves crashed over the deck, and water leaked into the lower levels. Many passengers grew seasick, lying helpless in their bunks. Others tried to cook simple meals, but the food quickly spoiled. Drinking water turned stale, and clean conditions were impossible. Everyday life was a struggle. Children cried from hunger, mothers tried to comfort them, and men prayed for calm seas. The noise of creaking wood and pounding waves never stopped. At night, the darkness was overwhelming, broken only by lanterns that flickered in the wind. And yet, the Pilgrims endured. They sang hymns to keep their spirits alive. They shared what little they had. And they held on to their faith that beyond the horizon lay freedom and a new beginning. By October, fierce storms battered the Mayflower. At one point, the main beam cracked, and many feared the ship would sink. But with determination, the crew repaired it, and the journey continued. After more than 2 months at sea, hope finally returned. In November 1620, a lookout cried, "Land!" The long, miserable voyage was over. The Pilgrims had survived hunger, sickness, storms, and fear. Life aboard the Mayflower had tested them in every way, but their courage carried them through. For 66 days, that tiny ship was their entire world. And when they finally stepped onto the shores of the New World, they carried with them not just exhaustion, but the strength and faith that would build. November 1620. After 66 difficult days at sea, the Mayflower finally sighted land. But something was wrong. The Pilgrims had planned to settle in Virginia, where they had permission from the English crown. Instead, storms had blown them far off course. They had arrived in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, outside the boundaries of English law. This created a serious problem. Some of the passengers, who were not part of the Pilgrim group, began to argue. They said, "We are not in Virginia. We are free to do as we wish." Without rules, without order, their new colony could fall into chaos before it even began. So, the leaders gathered together. On the cold morning of November 11, 1620, inside the small cabin of the Mayflower, they wrote a short but powerful document. It began simply, "In the name of God, Amen." And then, it laid out their purpose, to form a civil body politic, to make just and equal laws, and to work together for the good of the colony. This agreement became known as the Mayflower Compact. It was only about 200 words long, but those words carried great weight. For the first time in the New World, free men agreed to govern themselves, not by kings, not by bishops, but by laws they created together. One by one, 41 men signed their names. Rich or poor, pilgrim or stranger, they pledged loyalty to each other and to the idea of self-government. The Mayflower Compact was not a grand constitution, but it was a beginning. A seed of democracy planted on the rocky shores of Plymouth. From that simple agreement grew the belief that government should come from the consent of the governed, a belief that would later shape the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the United States itself. So, in that cramped ship's cabin, with the ocean wind howling outside, the Pilgrims gave America one of its first and most important gifts. The idea that freedom must walk hand in hand with responsibility. The Mayflower Compact was more than just ink on. On a cold morning in December 1620, the Pilgrims finally prepared to step off the Mayflower. After more than 2 months at sea, they had reached the shores of the New World. But the land before them was not the warm, fertile Virginia they had hoped for. Instead, they found the frozen, rocky coast of Massachusetts. Winter had already arrived. The trees were bare, the winds were sharp, and snow covered the ground. According to legend, the Pilgrims first set foot on a great stone by the water's edge, later called Plymouth Rock. Whether or not the story is true, that rock became a symbol of their arrival and their courage. The Pilgrims looked out at the vast wilderness. There were no houses, no towns, no farms, only forests and icy streams. Everything they needed, they would have to build with their own hands. First, they chose a site for their settlement, a place with fresh water, good timber, and a safe harbor. They named it Plymouth, after the port in England where their journey began. Life was brutally hard from the start. The Pilgrims built small, rough shelters, just enough to keep out the cold. Food was scarce, and many fell sick. By the end of that first winter, half of the original passengers had died. And yet, even in the face of loss, the survivors did not give up. They worked together, guided by their faith and by the Mayflower Compact they had signed. Slowly, a new community began to take shape. Their landing was more than just the beginning of a town. It was the birth of an idea that in this new land people could start fresh, living not by the rule of kings, but by their own agreements, their own labor, and their own hopes. The story of Plymouth Rock has been told for generations. Whether the Pilgrims actually stood on that stone or not, it represents something far greater, the courage to step into the unknown and begin again. From that frozen December day, the colony at Plymouth became the first chapter in a new history, one that would help shape the. When the Pilgrims landed in December 1620, winter had already set in. The ground was frozen. Snow and icy winds cut through the small shelters they built. And for the weary travelers, life in the New World began with hardship. The Pilgrims had little food. Supplies from the Mayflower quickly ran out. Hunting was difficult, and farming was impossible in the frozen soil. Many survived on just corn they traded or small amounts of fish they could catch. Hunger gnawed at them every day. But hunger was not the only enemy. Sickness spread quickly. The long sea voyage had already weakened them, and now, in the damp and cold, diseases like scurvy and pneumonia struck. Families huddled together in crowded huts, and illness moved from one person to another. At times, only a handful of people were healthy enough to care for the sick. They carried water, gathered firewood, and cooked what little food they had, while others lay helpless. The winter was merciless. By spring, almost half of the Pilgrims had died, men, women, and children. Graves were dug quietly on a nearby hill, and to protect the colony from enemies, the survivors hid the true number of deaths by planting corn over the fresh earth. It was a season of sorrow, testing the strength of every heart. Yet even in their darkest moments, the Pilgrims did not give up. They prayed, they worked, and they clung to the hope that warmer days would come. And when spring finally arrived, so did help, from the Native Americans who would teach them how to plant, hunt, and live in this strange new land. The first winter was a trial by fire. It stripped the Pilgrims of comfort, of safety, even of loved ones. But it also proved their resilience. Out of hunger, sickness, and loss, the survivors found the courage to continue, and to build the colony of Plymouth. Their struggle was not in vain. From that bitter winter came the beginnings of a story that would echo for centuries. The story of endurance, faith, and the hope of a new era. By the spring of 1621, the Pilgrims had survived their first terrible winter, but only barely. Half of their number had died from hunger, cold, and disease. Those who remained were weak and uncertain about their future in this strange new land. Then, something remarkable happened. One day, a native man walked into the settlement. To the Pilgrims' amazement, he spoke a little English. His name was Samoset. He had learned English from fishermen and traders along the coast. Samoset welcomed the Pilgrims, and soon after, he introduced them to another native man who would change their lives forever, Squanto. Squanto's story was extraordinary. Years earlier, he had been kidnapped by English explorers, taken across the ocean, and later found his way back home. Because of this, he spoke English fluently. And now, instead of turning away from the Pilgrims, he chose to help them. Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to survive in the New World. He showed them how to plant corn, using fish as fertilizer to make the soil rich. He taught them where to find wild plants for food and medicine, and the best places to fish and hunt. Through Squanto, the Pilgrims also made contact with the local tribe, the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit. After tense meetings, they formed a peace treaty, a promise to protect each other and to live as allies. For more than 50 years, that treaty held. With the knowledge and friendship of Squanto and the Wampanoag, the colony began to grow stronger. The fields produced food, the settlers learned new skills, and hope replaced fear. This friendship was not just survival. It was the beginning of a bond between two peoples who, despite their differences, found common ground. The Pilgrims had crossed an ocean seeking freedom, but it was the generosity of the Native Americans that allowed them to truly begin their new life. Without Squanto's guidance, and without the peace with Massasoit and his people, the story of Plymouth might have ended before it began. By the autumn of 1621, the Pilgrims had something they had not felt in a long time: hope. After a year of hardship, their fields were full. With the help of Squanto and the Wampanoag tribe, the Pilgrims had learned to plant corn, hunt game, and gather wild food. For the first time since their arrival, there was enough to eat. Governor William Bradford declared that it was time to give thanks. So the Pilgrims planned a feast, a celebration not just of survival, but of friendship and new beginnings. They invited their neighbors, the Wampanoag people, including their leader Chief Massasoit. When the Native Americans arrived, they did not come alone. More than 90 men joined the feast, carrying deer and other gifts to share. For 3 days, Pilgrims and Wampanoags sat together. They ate roasted venison, corn, beans, squash, wild fowl, and fish. They played games, fired muskets for sport, and joined in friendly contests. Laughter filled the air where once there had been only hunger and fear. It was more than a meal. It was a symbol that two very different peoples could come together, share their blessings, and celebrate side by side. The Pilgrims gave thanks to God for their survival. The Wampanoag gave thanks for the bounty of the land. And together, they honored the spirit of gratitude. That autumn feast became a story told through generations. Centuries later, it inspired the American holiday we now call Thanksgiving. Of course, history would not always remain peaceful between settlers and Native Americans. But in that moment, in the fall of 1621, there was harmony. The first Thanksgiving was not about grand speeches or fine traditions. It was about people who had endured hardship, found friendship, and learned to be grateful for the simple gift of life. And from that gathering around rough wooden tables, a tradition was born, one that still reminds us every year to pause, to give thanks, and to remember that even in the hardest times, gratitude can bring us to. The Pilgrims' story did not end with the Mayflower or even with their first harvest. Their true legacy lives on, in the culture, democracy, and traditions of the United States. When the Pilgrims left England, they carried with them a simple dream, to live in freedom, guided by their faith and their own choices. That dream shaped everything they built in Plymouth. The Mayflower Compact, signed before they ever stepped on shore, was more than a promise. It was the first experiment in self-government in the New World. It said that laws should come from the consent of the people, not the command of a king. That idea would echo through American history, into town meetings, colonial assemblies, and eventually the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Their hardships also shaped American values. The Pilgrims endured hunger, disease, and loss, yet they pressed forward with courage and faith. Their story became a symbol of resilience, teaching future generations that freedom often comes with sacrifice. And of course, their celebration with the Wampanoag in 1621 planted the seed of one of America's most beloved traditions, Thanksgiving. Every November, families across the nation gather around the table to share a meal and give thanks, echoing that first feast nearly 4 centuries ago. But the Pilgrims' legacy is not just political or cultural, it is also personal. They remind us of the power of community, of people working together through hardship, bound by common hope. They remind us that America was built not by ease, but by determination. Today, their story is woven into the very fabric of American identity. From the classroom to the dinner table, from history books to national holidays, the Pilgrims are remembered as pioneers who helped shape a nation. Their journey was not perfect. Their history is complex. But their legacy endures: freedom of worship, self-government, gratitude, and perseverance. More than 400 years later, the story of Th.